December 7, 1941, just before 8 a.m., above the island of Oahu. The skies over Pearl Harbor had been silent moments before, a typical Hawaiian Sunday morning, peaceful and utterly unprepared. Now, they were filled with the droning roar of hundreds of engines, a sound that instantly transformed the serene panorama into a crucible of war. The first wave of Imperial Japanese Navy aircraft, launched from 6 unseen carriers over the horizon, descended upon the unsuspecting American fleet anchored below. Among the most feared of these approaching machines was the Mitsubishi A6M, quickly nicknamed the Zero by Allied forces. It was a masterpiece of aeronautical engineering for its time, designed under the exacting specifications of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto to possess unparalleled range and maneuverability. At the outset of the Pacific War, the Zero was simply unmatched. It was faster than almost anything the Americans could put in the air, but crucially, it was lighter, granting it a turning radius that baffled and terrified Allied pilots. Early encounters were devastating for the United States Army Air Forces and the naval aviators. Pilots flying the slower, heavier, and less maneuverable American planes, primarily the Grumman F4F Wildcat, found themselves outclassed in every aspect of the dogfight. The Zero pilots, many of whom were veterans of the Sino-Japanese War, were skilled, aggressive, and confident in the superiority of their mount. They flew circles around their opponents, their 20mm cannon shells ripping apart the lightly armored American fuselages. The narrative emerging from the first months of the war was one of Japanese air invincibility. From the Philippines to the Dutch East Indies and across the major engagements in the Coral Sea and Midway, the Zero reigned supreme. American tactics, based on the traditional close-quarters turning fight, were disastrous. Try to match the Zero in a spin or a loop, and the American pilot was invariably dead within moments. The Japanese pilots knew this. They flew with an almost contemptuous aggression, often positioning themselves directly on the tail of the Wildcat, enjoying the terrifying advantage of speed and agility. They had reason to be cocky. Their losses were minimal, while the attrition rate of American squadrons was unsustainable. The Wildcat, despite its flaws, was built like a tank compared to the fragile Zero. The Japanese achieved their lightweight miracle by sacrificing pilot protection and fuel tank sealing. The Wildcat, though slow, could absorb damage that would instantly obliterate an A6M. But the armor and self-sealing fuel tanks were irrelevant if the pilot couldn't avoid the initial burst of fire. The air combat reports flowing back to operational headquarters were grim, painting a picture of total aerial dominance by the enemy. It seemed that the Zero was an unstoppable force, a weapon that had reared existing Allied air doctrine obsolete. Something drastic had to change, and quickly, or the entire Pacific campaign would be lost before it began. The answer wouldn't come from a new plane, but from a radical new way of flying the old one. February 12, 1942, in the engineering offices of the Bureau of Aeronautics, the performance specifications of the only frontline carrier fighter available were under intense scrutiny. That machine was the Grumman F4F Wildcat. It was not a beautiful airplane, nor was it particularly fast. It was, however, the physical embodiment of the Grumman design philosophy, heavy, durable, and capable of taking immense punishment. Where the Japanese designed the Zero to be a graceful, lightweight instrument of pure offense, Grumman built the Wildcat like a flying tank. This emphasis on structural survivability came at a crippling cost in performance. Against the magnificent A6M Zero, the Wildcat was markedly inferior in almost every measurable category. The Zero could outclimb it, outturn it, and generally run circles around it below 15,000 feet. The Wildcat's top speed was marginally slower, its rate of roll sluggish, and its inherent lack of agility forced pilots into desperate vertical maneuvers just to avoid the enemy gun sights. The performance gap was so wide, it negated the Wildcat's excellent armament of .650 caliber machine guns. You couldn't shoot down what you couldn't track. Furthermore, the Wildcat suffered from 2 glaring mechanical deficiencies that routinely enraged the men who flew it. First, the landing gear mechanism was notoriously archaic and difficult to manage. Unlike the simple hydraulic systems of almost every other modern fighter, the Wildcat required the pilot to manually pump a hand crank, sometimes up to 29 full rotations, just to retract the landing gear after takeoff or deploy it for landing. Doing this while trying to maintain formation, or worse, while under enemy fire, was a physically demanding distraction that stole precious seconds of attention and energy from the fight. Second, and perhaps more dangerous, was the Wildcat's narrow-track landing gear. Built to fold inward into the fuselage, the gear provided a notoriously tippy stance on the carrier deck. Carrier landings were challenging enough in rough seas, but the Wildcat's tendency to bounce or even pivot violently upon touchdown caused countless ground loops, accidents, and injuries, earning it the grim, unofficial nickname of the Grumman death trap among some frustrated flight crews. The pilots climbing into the cramped high-wing cockpits knew exactly what they were flying: an underdog. A tough, reliable little brick of an airplane, yes, but one that was fundamentally mismatched against the leggery speed and maneuverability of their primary foe. They understood that the Wildcat's main technical advantages, thick armor plating, self-sealing fuel tanks, and superior firepower, were only useful if the pilot could somehow survive the initial, overwhelming engagement. American air superiority, and indeed the survival of the carriers themselves, depend not on superior engineering, but entirely on superior strategy, and one man was about to deliver it. June 4th, 1942, 6030A. MR. Over the skies northwest of Midway Atoll, the first waves of Japanese torpedo bombers, escorted by their elite fighter screen, roared toward the American carriers, and the Wildcat pilots of the carrier air groups went up to meet them, expecting a dogfight. They received a relentless lesson in aerial humility. The Mitsubishi A6M Zero, specifically the Model 2, was an aviation enigma. It was a fighter designed for the specific needs of the Imperial Japanese Navy: extreme range and unparalleled agility. To achieve this, Japanese engineers sacrificed nearly every defensive feature the Americans considered sacred. The Zero's lightness was its weapon, allowing it to perform maneuvers that seemed to defy the very laws of physics. In a traditional turning fight, the Zero was king. It could reverse direction, loop, and position itself on the tail of its American counterpart in a fraction of the time required by the heavier Grumman F4F Wildcat. American pilots found their rugged, heavily armored machines to be slow, predictable targets when engaged in low-altitude maneuvering. The Wildcat was a brute. The Zero was a lethal ballerina. If a Wildcat pilot tried to match the Zero's turn radius, he quickly found himself wallowing in the air, momentum bleeding away as the Zero pilot, highly experienced from years of combat over China, accelerated effortlessly into the perfect firing position. The pilots of the Japanese carrier fleets, believing their design superior, openly laughed at the American planes, deeming them sluggish and easy prey. The kill ratio in these initial engagements, from the Coral Sea to Guadalcanal, reflected this terrifying superiority. Often, American losses outnumbered Japanese losses by 3, 4, or even 6 to 1, the standard American defensive tactic. The Lufbery Circle, where planes flew in a defensive ring to protect each other's tails, proved useless. The Zero pilots simply treated the circle like a rotating shooting gallery, darting in and out, picking off planes before the slower, to accelerate, Wildcat could bring its concentrated fire to bear. The strategic dilemma was complete. The Wildcat could absorb damage and dish out heavy fire, but only if it could stay alive long enough to shoot. The Zero's agility ensured the American planes rarely had that chance. They were not losing because their equipment was incapable of killing the enemy, but because they were physically incapable of positioning themselves to land a single, decisive blow. The engineers in the United States could not rapidly re-engineer the F4F to compete on equal terms with the Zero's turning performance. They could not magically make the American machine lighter without stripping away the essential armor and self-sealing tanks that kept American casualties from being even higher. The solution, therefore, had to be intellectual rather than mechanical. The pilots had to stop playing the Zero's game, the turning fight, and instead force the enemy into a realm where the Wildcat's speed, dive rate, and concentrated firepower could be used strategically. This was the crisis facing Lieutenant Commander John Thach, a dedicated aviator and tactical genius assigned to Fighting Squadron 3 aboard the USS Lexington. Observing the initial brutal encounters, Thach recognized that the very feature that made the Zero deadly, its ability to get on a pilot's tail, could be reversed, turning the hunter into the hunted. Provided the American pilots completely abandoned their ingrained notions of how a dogfight should be fought. He spent hours sketching diagrams on cocktail napkins and blackboards, trying to mathematically model an aerial maneuver that allowed two slower, less agile fighters to def each other simultaneously while maximizing their fields of fire. His radical idea, which looked absurdly simple on paper, was the last hope for the American naval air campaign in the Pacific. The early days of the Pacific War were defined by a profound terror that gripped the cockpits of American naval aviators. When facing the Mitsubishi A6M Zero, the pilots of the F4F Wildcat felt less like hunters and more like prey. The Zero was a marvel of aviation engineering, fast, impossibly agile, and equipped with a range that dwarfed anything the U.S. Navy possessed. Japanese pilots, often veterans of combat over China, flew with an aggressive confidence that bordered on disdain. They learned quickly that the sturdy, heavy Wildcat could not possibly turn with them. For the American flyers, the Wildcat's inherent limitations meant that traditional dogfighting was tantamount to suicide. They were taught the boom and zoom tactic, hit fast from altitude and run, but often found themselves entangled with Zeros that refused to let go. Casualty rates among the fighter squadrons climbed alarmingly high. There was a desperate fear, often referred to as zeroitis, where the mere mention of the enemy fighter's name could drain the color from a pilot's face. Japanese pilots openly mocked the Wildcat, calling it the flying barrel or the Grumman truck, laughing at the lumbering characteristics of the American naval fighter. They knew if they engaged the American machine in a flat-turning fight, victory was almost guaranteed. John Thach was painfully aware of the psychological and physical imbalance. His mathematical solution, the Thach Weave, looked ridiculous to pilots accustomed to the single-minded focus of individual aerial combat. Why would two men voluntarily fly toward each other, crossing paths and creating a collision hazard when under attack? It violated the fundamental rules of air safety and conventional tactics. Thach had to overcome not just the enemy, but the entrenched skepticism of his own men in Fighting Squadron 3, VF3. He took to the skies over the vast, empty Pacific, using his own wingman, Lieutenant Edward O'Hare, to prove the theory. They practiced for hours, drilling the synchronized break and cross maneuver until it became reflexive. The idea was elegantly brutal. If a Zero locked onto the tail of Thach's Wildcat, Thach would brake hard to the left, while O'Hare, his wingman, would brake hard to the right, flying directly into the line of fire of the pursuing Zero. The enemy pilot had only two choices: continue the attack and fly straight into the guns of the defing wingman, or break off the attack to avoid the head-on pass. Either way, the Zero's attack was spoiled and the American plane was defed. The pilots of the F3 were skeptical, but they trusted Thach. They had to. Their survival depended on an impossible geometric dance. They practiced the move relentlessly, two planes weaving through the sky like synchronized swimmers, preparing for a battle that would decide the fate of the Pacific Fleet. The theory was solid. The training was intense, but until it was tested under the unforgiving pressure of real combat against pilots who were masters of the air, it remained just chalk dust diagrams and desperate hope. That test arrived swiftly and brutally in June of 1942 in the skies over an atoll called Midway. June 4th, 1942, shortly after dawn, high above the churning sapphire waters north of Midway Atoll, Lieutenant Commander John Thach saw his fate, and perhaps the fate of the American Air War, approaching. The air was already thick with the smell of exhaust and ozone, and the radio screamed with frantic, broken reports of contacts. Thach, leading 8 F4F Wildcat fighters of Fighting Squadron 3, VF3, watched the enemy arrive. There were more than 40 of them, the sleek, devastatingly effective Mitsubishi A6M Zeros, descending upon the small, underpowered American formation like a swarm of angry hornets. The Zero pilots, veteran aces of the opening months of the war, saw the Wildcats and laughed, radioing their confidence. They knew the American planes were heavy, slow, and incapable of matching the Zero in a turning fight. For months, this superior maneuverability had been a death sentence for any Allied pilot who dared to tangle with them one-on-one. But Thach was not playing the game one-on-one. He was flying a geometric puzzle, and he was about to spring the trap he had designed over months of obsessive study. As the first 4 Zeros committed to their high-speed diving attacks, Thach's heart pounded, but his voice was steady and crisp over the radio. He gave the command, a simple code word, and his 4 divisions instantly implemented the maneuver. Instead of breaking away individually, turning sharply to evade the immediate threat, the planes remained in their pairs, weaving back and forth laterally, flying toward and then away from their partner on a strict, coordinated course. The attacking Japanese pilot, accustomed to seeing his prey scatter like quail, suddenly found the air crowded and complicated. He locked onto Thach's plane, lining up the shot, but as he closed the distance, Thach drove hard left, flying directly toward his wingman, Lieutenant Junior Grade Robert Dibb. The move was counterintuitive, requiring immense trust, but it was executed perfectly. The Zero driver, still focused on Thach, had to adjust, but in that fractional moment of adjustment, he committed to the space between the 2 Wildcat fighters. He had flown right into the kill zone. As the Zero flashed through the narrow gap, both Thach and Dibb simultaneously slewed their planes slightly and opened fire. The crossing patterns meant that if one fighter missed the target, the other was instantly positioned to engage with a clear, converging line of fire. The burst of heavy, 50 caliber machine gun fire from both Wildcats ripped the Zero open, transforming the elegant machine into a tumbling wreck that spiraled downward into the vast ocean. The Zero's wingman, coming in a split second later, was equally baffled. He saw his leader explode and hesitated, momentarily losing the necessary aggression of the attack. He tried to follow Thach through the turn, only to find himself directly facing the guns of Dibb, who had completed his cross and was turning back into the formation. The second Zero was also shot down. In the span of 90 seconds, the analysis Thach had painstakingly developed on paper came alive in the chaos of battle. The Thach Weave fundamentally changed the calculus of air combat. It took the Wildcat's weakness, its inability to turn quickly, and transformed it into an inherent strength, demanding that the attacking enemy count not with a single target, but with a constantly shifting, interlocking field of fire. It was a perfect application of defensive firepower projection. Thach's division, using the maneuver repeatedly throughout the engagement, managed to hold their ground against overwhelming numbers, exacting a disproportionate toll on the Zero force. They were not merely surviving, they were succeeding. The pilots who returned that day were no longer desperate men flying an inferior machine. They were masters of a system that gave them parity, often superiority, against the best fighters in the world. The immediate significance of the Weave lay in the protection it offered. The bombers and torpedo planes that delivered the fatal blows to the Japanese carrier fleet. The strategic shift was profound. Until Midway, the Japanese held a psychological edge, believing their pilots and aircraft were untouchable. Thach's geometric solution shattered that confidence. It meant that every American pilot, even those flying defensively, was now part of a collective offensive weapon. For John Thach, Midway validated his core belief that victory in the air was as much a product of rigorous analysis and operational planning as it was of individual skill. He was not satisfied merely being a brilliant pilot. He was dedicated to being a systematic thinker, a man whose real contribution was taking the abstract geometry of space and speed and turning it into a tangible, repeatable process for saving lives and winning battles. His job was to teach the Navy how to fight smarter, and Midway was only the first bloody confirmation of his teaching. The problem of the Zero was solved, but Thach immediately began looking toward the next inevitable tactical challenge, knowing that air warfare was a relentless, ever-evolving intellectual game, and the enemy was always adapting. His next assignment would take him away from the immediate heat of combat and into the essential, dry work of disseminating the lessons of Midway across the entire fleet. The analyst was moving from the cockpit to the chalkboard, preparing a generation of pilots for the protracted war that stretched ahead. September 30th, 1942, aboard the USS Saratoga, deep in the South Pacific. The first reports filtering back from the squadrons operating out of Herson Field were grimly repetitive, painted in the blood of green aviators. The instructors and analysts who reviewed the after-action summaries found themselves confronted not by isolated incidents of poor flying, but by a consistent, disastrous pattern. American pilots, trained in the pre-war orthodoxy of turning and maneuvering, were committing suicide the moment they engaged the Japanese Mitsubishi A6M Zero. For generations, air combat had been taught as a three-dimensional joust, a horizontal ballet where the best pilot won by outturning his opponent and getting onto the 6 o'clock position. This doctrine had worked beautifully in slower aircraft, but it was absolute poison when flying the heavy, sturdy Grumman F4F Wildcat against the light, hyper-agile Zero. The Wildcat had superior armor, self-sealing fuel tanks, and hydraulic systems that could take incredible punishment, but these attributes came at the steep cost of weight and wing loading. The Zero, built around the philosophy of maximum range and maximum maneuverability, was virtually a flying fuel tank with a powerful engine, unburdened by the protective weight the Americans demanded. Its pilot could hang the plane on its propeller, executing turns the Wildcat could only dream of achieving. When a young, inexperienced pilot spotted a Zero and engaged in the classic high G-turning fight he had practiced back home, the engagement usually lasted less than 90 seconds before the American aircraft was shot down or forced into a screaming, uncontrolled dive. The realization that traditional dogfighting was fundamentally flawed was a crushing burden for the command structure to bear. It meant that every pilot sent up, adhering strictly to the textbook maneuvers they had been taught, was essentially flying straight into a meat grinder. The Wildcat was a superb diving platform, immensely strong in recovery, and faster than the Zero in a vertical plunge, yet its pilots were ignoring these strengths to focus on the Zero's most devastating advantage. The enemy pilots quickly learned to exploit this tactical error. They did not fear the Wildcat head-on because they knew that once the two planes were slow enough, the Zero became untouchable. They would deliberately bait the Americans into a swirling, turning melee, laughing, as the early reports claimed, at the slower rate of roll and the lumbering arc of the F4F. The Wildcat's only true tactical edge, aside from its sheer survivability, lay in the vertical axis, using the power of gravity to convert altitude into speed, delivering a brief, devastating burst of fire, and then climbing back up to altitude or diving away before the Zero could complete its turn. But this boom and zoom strategy required absolute discipline and a total rejection of the established culture of aerial combat, where running away was equated with cowardice. The pilots who survived the early encounters were the ones who jettisoned doctrine for physics, but they were few. The vast majority learned the hard lesson only once, leaving behind shattered remains and urgent calls for a radical rethinking of how the Pacific War would be fought above the carriers. The tactical analysis wasn't just about the plane, it was about the man and how to rewire his instinctive reaction away from the fatal urge to turn and stay. This intellectual puzzle, how to protect a vulnerable plane using teamwork and geometry, became the singular focus of men like Lieutenant Commander John Thach. He understood that survival wouldn't come from a better engine or lighter airframe, but from an entirely new geometry of attack and defense. August 14, 1941, aboard the USS Saratoga, John Thach stared intently at a pad of graph paper spread across his small desk. He was calculating the lethal angles of engagement, determining exactly how long a Mitsubishi A6M Zero pilot had to pull the trigger before a Grumman F4F Wildcat pilot could effectively react. The raw numbers were terrifying. At the closed speeds of combat, the Zero's superior performance meant that any attempt by the Wildcat to turn inward toward the attacker, the instinctive maneuver inherited from biplane combat, resulted in the Wildcat presenting a perfect, slow-moving target in its opponent's sights. The solution, he realized, lay not in avoiding the threat, but in transforming the threat zone into a kill zone for the other frilly plane. Thach began to sketch two planes, designated simply as lead and wingman, flying in close proximity. Instead of the traditional staggered formation, which left the leader vulnerable to a high-side attack, he theorized placing the wingman parallel, separated only by a few hundred feet, flying in what he termed the beam defense position. This required absolute discipline and trust. The two aircraft maintained a perfectly level, constant course, wings slightly overlapping in coverage area. The geometric brilliance of this configuration was simple yet revolutionary. If a lone Zero came screaming down on the leader from above and behind, the classic high-side attack that Japanese pilots favored, the leader was instructed not to turn. He held his course. The Zero pilot, anticipating the standard defensive break, would initiate his firing run, focusing laser-like on the leader's tail. But as the Zero closed in, it flew directly into the firing cone of the wingman, who was maintaining the beam defense position just yards away. The Zero, fixated on the primary target, suddenly found itself perfectly aligned for a deadly high-deflection shot from the side, effectively trapping the attacker in a box of converging fire. The next calculation concerned the complex reaction time necessary to avoid collisions when both planes engaged in simultaneous evasive maneuvers. Thach used his ruler and pencil to chart out the coordinated movement that would save them both. If the Zero successfully targeted the leader and initiated a firing pass, the leader would break sharply inward towards the wingman's previous position. Simultaneously, the wingman would break sharply outward and slightly upward away from the leader. This dual crossing maneuver ensured two things. First, that both planes were maneuvering defensively to avoid the bullets, and second, that they seamlessly swapped roles. The original defer now became the bait, and the original support plane now became the aggressor, pulling the trigger the instant the pursuing Zero crossed their path. Thach meticulously timed the entire sequence down to the second, concluding that if both pilots initiated the cross immediately upon sighting the attacker's firing solution, the Wildcat could survive. The system demanded that pilots abandon every instinct they had ever learned in solo combat. It required flying straight when you desperately wanted to turn and trusting your partner's precise actions with your life. But on paper, the physics were undeniable. For the first time, the slow, sturdy Wildcat could harness the very speed and commitment of its enemy against itself. It was the birth of air combat geometry, formalized and ready for the merciless reality of the Pacific theater. April 19, 1942, aboard the USS Lexington, steaming off the California coast, Lieutenant Commander Jimmy Thach stood on the crowded hangar deck, trying to sell his radical new defense plan to a group of skeptical, hard-bitten naval aviators. Thach knew that paper diagrams and theoretical physics meant nothing to men who faced the terrifying reality of the Mitsubishi Zero's speed advantage. They looked at the diagram with the two weaving aircraft, crisscrossing one another, and their instincts screamed betrayal. A fighter pilot's first law is maneuverability, to turn hard into the danger, to evade, to outthink the enemy in a three-dimensional chess match of G-forces. Thach was asking them to disregard this fundamental truth. He was demanding they fly straight for 5 critical seconds while a bogey closed on their tail, relying entirely on their partner to make the turn that saved them both. It defied every ounce of solo aggression instilled during their training. The early practice sessions were fraught with tension and near misses. The pilots of Fighter Squadron 3, or VF3, struggled bitterly with the concept of mutual dependence. Their mock engagements were flown far above the usual traffic patterns, often resulting in confused, disorganized messes. The separation distance was the killer. If the wingman flew too far out, the enemy could slip through the gap. If he flew too close, the danger of mid-air collision during the cross was catastrophic. The timing felt unnatural. The pilot under attack had to resist the powerful urge to turn immediately. He had to hold the line, draw the theoretical enemy, represented in practice by a fellow Wildcat, simulating a high-speed attack directly into the partner's firing path. This demanded extraordinary self-control, the absolute suppression of the fight-or-flight reflex that screamed, "Turn now!" Thach was relentless. He flew with every single pilot, acting as both the attacker and the defer, forcing them through the weave hundreds of times until the geometry began to sink in, not just intellectually, but physically. He nicknamed the process cutting the cord, referring to the moment the pilot finally severed his instinctual dependence on solo maneuverability. The pilots griped. They called it the chicken dance and worried they were learning an aerial suicide pact instead of a doctrine for survival. But the results, once achieved, were staggering. In the controlled environment of their training airspace, a two-plane element executing the Thach Weave properly became virtually immune to a single plane attack, regardless of the attacker's superior speed. When the simulated Zero made its high-speed pass on the first Wildcat, committing to the attack, the pilot of the second Wildcat initiated his turn, placing him perfectly for a broadside shot at the committed attacker. The Zero pilot was trapped by his own momentum. He could not disengage or adjust without presenting an immediate target. The skepticism began to crumble. The pilots who had complained about sacrificing their turn radius realized they weren't turning away from the fight. They were simply delaying their turn to maximize their combined offensive opportunity. They were trading a defensive maneuver for a guaranteed counteroffensive kill zone. It was no longer about individual heroism. It was about clockwork precision and collective trust. A radical new mindset for a service focused on ace status. Thach hammered home the necessity of calling out the attack, maintaining the precise separation of 500 to 700 feet, and above all, believing in the geometry, even when the enemy was filling the windscreen. They were preparing for a different kind of war, a war of mathematics that would soon be tested in the furnace of the Central Pacific, where failure meant being swept into the waves by an enemy they had previously underestimated. Their last practice sessions ended not in confusion, but in a grudging, then proud acceptance of the fact that the slow Wildcat had just been given the deadliest defense in the sky. August 7, 1942, off the coast of Tulagi in the Solomon Islands, the skies roared with the desperate sound of an invasion struggling to secure a foothold. The USS Marines had just landed on Guadalcanal, an island vital to the control of the Solomons chain, but the American air shield was weak, held together by slow, heavy F4F Wildcats facing the established aerial supremacy of the Mitsubishi Zero. For months, the Wildcat had been little more than a climbing target, outmaneuvered and outclassed by the sleek geometry of the enemy aircraft. The Japanese aircrews knew their advantage was absolute. But high above the landing transports, flying from the deck of the carrier Saratoga, waited John Thach and the pilots of Fighting Squadron 72, who were about to introduce a lethal variable into the equation. They were flying the math they had practiced, betting their lives on the interlocking precision of the weave. The first major response from the enemy arrived in a massive strike package, formations of Bettys targeting the vulnerable transports covered by a dense cloud of patrolling Zeros eager to engage the American fighters. When the first Zeros spotted the Wildcats, they split their forces and dove, confident in their ability to slash through the American formation and execute their famous high-speed, high-angle passes. The pilot of the lead Zero targeted a lone F4F, closing fast from the 6 o'clock high position, anticipating the Wildcat pilot would break sharply downward or try a futile turn. The usual panicked responses. But this Wildcat did neither. Instead, as the Zero entered firing range, the targeted Wildcat and its wingman executed the synchronized brake. The lead plane turned hard left and down, while the wingman turned hard right and down. They did not attempt to escape the enemy's maneuver. They flew directly into a collision path with each other, crossing the imaginary attack line the Zero was committed to. The attacking Japanese pilot suddenly found the airspace he had meticulously calculated for his firing solution was now filled not with one victim, but with the crossing paths of 2 American planes. And worse, the plane that had just passed across his nose. The wingman was now pointing its 6 .50 caliber machine guns directly into the path of the Zero's inevitable exit vector. The Zero pilot, committed to a pass at over 300 miles an hour, was confronted with an instantaneous switch. He had gone from aggressor to victim in the space of 2 seconds. He had to break off the attack immediately, pulling violently away or risk flying straight into a hail of fire from the plane he believed was merely defensive support. The effect on the Japanese formation was immediate and devastating. The Zeros, reliant on one-pass kills and fluid maneuvering, found their entire doctrine invalidated. They could no longer isolate a single aircraft without flying into a coordinated, overlapping cone of fire. The Wildcat, slow and heavy, had gained an invulnerability that its design never promised. In the ensuing melee, the Wildcat pilots, flying in rigid, disciplined pairs, achieved a phenomenal success rate. The Thach Weave did not allow the American fighter to outrun the Zero, but it neutralized the Zero's devastating speed and turning radius by always presenting the attacker with a deadly defensive trap. Word of the tactic spread rapidly through the squadrons operating in the Solomons. The kill ratio, which had often favored the Japanese 4 or 5 to 1, now dramatically reversed. Over Guadalcanal, the American fighter defense finally had teeth. Japanese pilots reported confusion and disbelief. They saw the American planes making what appeared to be suicidal maneuvers, flying toward each other with no apparent regard for the Zero's presence. They could not conceive that such a simple geometric pattern could eliminate their intrinsic performance advantage. They theorized that the Americans had received secret new engines or perhaps armor plating that allowed them to absorb hits. They never grasped the simple, devastating truth. Their superior design had been defeated not by technology, but by tactics based on mutual support and synchronized aggression. Every time the Wildcat pair began their lethal dance, the Zero was forced to choose between breaking off the attack or flying directly into the sights of the enemy aircraft it was attempting to save its partner from. Guadalcanal became the testing ground, where the theory moved into doctrine. Pilots like Joe Foss and Marion Carl used the Weave relentlessly in the grinding, brutal campaign to hold Hersenfield, turning the vulnerable Wildcat into a feared opponent and shattering the myth of the invincible Zero. The slow Wildcat survived, not through speed, but through the courage of the man flying 600 feet away, trusting that the weaving pattern would catch the unwary predator every time. This was not merely survival, it was the birth of American tactical dominance in the Pacific Air War. June 4, 1942, 6003A, MM. Over the skies northwest of Midway Atoll, Lieutenant Commander John Thach led the few remaining serviceable F4F Wildcats from Fighting Squadron 3, waiting patiently for the inevitable arrival of the strike force from the Japanese carrier Kaga. The routine was always the same for the pilots of the Kido Butai: desk rapidly, exploit the superior turning radius and velocity of the Zero, and eliminate the sluggish American fighter opposition before they could interfere with the bomber run. On this morning, however, Thach was not flying merely to intercept. He was flying to spring a meticulous trap that he had developed on a notepad months earlier. A flight of 3 Zeros, led by a highly decorated veteran pilot, peeled off high above to target Thach's formation. The two American aircraft were flying the new formation, Thach and his wingman flying tightly grouped, separated by barely 50 yards of air, an arrangement that seemed absurdly vulnerable to the fast, diving Japanese attackers. The leading Zero pilot adjusted his reflector sight, preparing for the customary brief burst that would send the American fighter tumbling down into the Pacific. He committed to the attack, coming in hard on the Wildcat's 6 o'clock position, his finger tightening on the firing stud. Just as the Zero entered lethal range, the two American fighters executed the predetermined, synchronized maneuver. The lead Wildcat broke sharply inward to the left. The wingman broke sharply inward to the right. The distance between them momentarily doubled, and then they crossed paths, exchanging positions in a sudden, precise shift. For the attacking Zero pilot, the effect was instantaneous and physically jarring. The target he had focused upon instantly vanished into a confusing blur of motion, replaced milliseconds later by the sudden appearance of the other Wildcat, which was now flying directly across his attack axis, perfectly lined up for a simultaneous defensive pass. The surprise was absolute. The Japanese pilot, struggling to maintain his high-speed commitment, realized too late that he was now flying straight into the sights of the second Wildcat. The American wingman, having crossed beneath his partner, now had a perfectly stable, head-on firing solution against the committed, non-maneuvering Zero attempting the stern chase. The predator had become the prey within a single second. The Japanese pilots, completely unfamiliar with this tactic, reacted with disbelief and confusion, often overshooting their initial target completely, exposing their vulnerable underbelly to the defing aircraft as they tried desperately to regain control and awareness. They had been taught that the Wildcat was slow, clumsy, and only survived if it died straight away. They had trained only to engage single, poorly flown targets. Encountering a formation that utilized the two-plane team as an interlocking offensive and defensive weapon was completely disorienting. They couldn't believe the lumbering American machine had simply swapped places with its comrade, leaving them caught in a deadly crossfire from which there was no immediate escape. Reports radioed back to the Japanese carrier command did not describe an improved American aircraft. They described an inexplicable, chaotic aerial dance that resulted in the immediate loss of all tactical advantage upon commitment. They used phrases that translated roughly to the spinning scissor or the confusing pattern. The Zero pilots, having trained to laugh at the F4F, were suddenly baffled by the Americans' refusal to fight conventionally. For the first time, American ingenuity, combined with intellectual superiority in tactics, had completely neutralized the Zero's devastating performance advantage, signaling a profound shift in the very nature of air combat over the Pacific. Thach Weave was not a defensive measure. It was the mechanism that forced the confident Japanese pilot directly into the path of inevitable destruction. The tide of the air war had begun to turn not with a new engine, but with two airplanes flying 600 feet apart. January 29, 1943, near Guadalcanal, 20,000 feet above the Solomons, was when the balance sheet of the air war was officially stamped with new, favorable numbers. Prior to the adoption of Lieutenant Commander Thach's radical pairing, American aviators were struggling to maintain a kill ratio often cited as barely 2-to-1 in their favor, and sometimes far worse in specific engagements against the elite Japanese air groups. This ratio, while seemingly positive, masked the underlying reality that for every 2 Zeros destroyed, the American loss was typically a valued veteran pilot, a resource the U.S. Navy could scarcely afford to exp at such a rate. The combat attrition, based purely on pilot skill and aircraft robustness, was heavily skewed against the Wildcat. But almost overnight, the arithmetic of the sky changed violently. The immediate engagements following the full integration of the beam defense maneuver into carrier doctrine saw the kill ratio begin a precipitous climb. Where once the Japanese pilot could rely on his superior turning radius to escape any immediate defensive fire before circling back for the inevitable kill shot, he now found himself flying directly into a field of pre-aimed, concentrated 50 caliber slugs. The very moment he crossed behind the lead plane, the wingman's fire, previously useless in a strict turn, became lethally accurate in the crossfire. In the hands of pilots from VF-10, the famed Grim Reapers or other frontline squadrons suddenly utilizing the Weave, the ratio soared, frequently settling at an astonishing 8-to-1 or 9-to-1 in favor of the Wildcat in localized dogfights. This was not a modest improvement. It was a revolution that drastically shifted the viability calculations of the F4F. The stunning reversal was immediately evident in logistics reports. The rate of loss of replacement aircraft and, more critically, the frequency of required replacement pilots dropped dramatically across the active carrier air groups. Naval staff officers, initially skeptical of any complex maneuver that departed from established single-plane combat tactics, could not ignore the raw data flowing from the South Pacific. The cost of maintaining air superiority had suddenly become sustainable. The once mocked Wildcat, the slow, clumsy truck of a fighter, was now proving capable of standing its ground simply because its pilot knew how to leverage geometry against speed. The sudden stabilization of the pilot corps was perhaps the most crucial victory. Experienced American pilots who would have been lost early in the attrition fight were now surviving countless sorties, turning their tactical knowledge and combat time into an insurmountable institutional advantage for the Navy. The Japanese pilots themselves struggled profoundly to adapt. They had been taught and had successfully executed a doctrine of individual mastery and overwhelming initial attack runs. They saw the two-plane formation as a sign of weakness, two clumsy targets offering double the reward. When their standard approach resulted in instant destruction, their ingrained confidence was not merely shaken, it was replaced by profound confusion. They often broke off attacks prematurely, unable to reconcile the easy target identification with the impossibility of maneuvering through the coordinated crossfire. For the first time, the speed and agility of the Zero became a liability when attempting to close the distance quickly for a kill shot. The faster the approach, the faster the pilot flew into the trap. The psychological toll of facing an enemy that suddenly possessed an impenetrable defense, one that turned a tactical disadvantage into an offensive trap, cannot be overstated. Combat reports captured from downed Japanese aviators frequently expressed frustration and confusion regarding the American willingness to engage in tight two-ship maneuvers that seemed, on paper, to contravene all sound air combat principles. They were facing an air force that had learned to cheat physics using basic tactics. The immediate reduction in American losses meant that the U.S. Navy could now focus not on survival, but on expanding the offensive, ensuring that the carrier battles of 1943 would not be fought merely for parity, but for absolute aerial dominance. The Wildcat, reared immediately obsolete by design, had been granted a reprieve long enough to shape the future of the Pacific Air War. The genius of the Thach Weave was that it required no new technology, only a fundamental shift in perception. It was immediately transferable. Within months of Midway, the Division Defensive Tactics Manual, the core text for all U.S. Navy and Marine air groups, was being rewritten, featuring John Thach's innovation not as an optional maneuver, but as standard operating procedure for any engagement involving enemy fighters. Training schools on the West Coast and in Hawaii rapidly integrated the maneuver into their curricula, turning pilots into highly coordinated pairs before they ever saw a combat zone. The training simulators, where they existed, were rewired to emphasize the need for tight spacing and instant communication between the two elements of the division. The true test of its longevity, however, came not in the hands of the rugged Wildcat, but with the arrival of its successors. The F-6F Hellcat, a heavier, faster, and infinitely more powerful fighter, began deploying widely in 1943. Pilots might have reasoned that the Weave, a tactic born of necessity due to the Wildcat's slow speed and poor climb rate compared to the Zero, would become redundant in the cockpit of the mighty Hellcat. They were wrong. The increased speed and rate of climb of the Hellcat merely amplified the lethality of Thach's system. When two Hellcats performed the Weave, they could execute the turn and crossover much faster, creating a trap that closed on the Japanese attacker with terrifying quickness. Furthermore, the 50 caliber machine guns of the Hellcat delivered a far heavier punch than the Wildcat's 4, meaning that any Zero caught traversing the kill zone had significantly less time to survive the encounter. The Weave transitioned seamlessly from a defensive lifeline to a punishing offensive maneuver. By late 1943 and into 1944, the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps had established unchallenged air superiority across the Central and Southwest Pacific. Japanese pilots, still adhering to rigid, individualistic dogfighting philosophies and relying on the inherent agility of their aging Zeros, were systematically dismantled by the disciplined, interwoven formations of American fighters. Whether facing the speed of the Corsair, the sheer firepower of the Hellcat, or even the updated models of the Wildcat in secondary theaters, American fighter divisions relied on the Weave for safety, coordination, and ultimately, victory. It was the fundamental language of aerial teamwork. John Thach's career mirrored the success of his tactic. Promoted repeatedly, he moved from the cockpit to the strategic planning room. His understanding of division integrity and combined arms warfare was so deep that he was instrumental in developing strategies for coordinating the massive fleet air attacks that would soon crush the remaining Japanese air defenses. He finished the war as a captain and went on to a highly distinguished post-war naval career, retiring as a 4-star admiral. He frequently credited the lessons learned in the desperate early days of the Pacific War lessons that demanded innovation over brute force as the foundation for all his future tactical thought. The Thach Weave never died. It tranced the propeller era and remains enshrined in the modern aerial fighting doctrine of the United States and NATO countries. While jets fight at supersonic speeds and beyond, visual range missile engagements dominate the core concept of maintaining mutual support, turning a pursuer into the pursued using coordinated movement, and ensuring the wingman is always protected remains an immutable principle of air combat. The two-plane formation synchronized in lethal defense developed by a lieutenant commander facing overwhelming odds became the definitive model for air combat teamwork across the world, a permanent testament to the fact that intellect and geometry can often defeat sheer mechanical superiority.